Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the GRIPS Forum. My name is Narushige Michita. I teach International Security Affairs at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, based in Tokyo. I'll be serving as your host today. Since taking office in January this year, Joe Biden has repeatedly said that the United States would put democracy and human rights at the center of US foreign policy, criticizing the Chinese government's human rights abuses in Xinjiang. However, international criticism has increasingly mounted regarding the inhumane consequences of US economic and financial sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. The Biden administration has also been criticized for its hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, abandoning Afghan women and religious minorities. What is the future of US human rights diplomacy? What are the greatest challenges to the future of human rights? Today, we have invited Professor Seiko Mimaki to answer those questions. Professor Mimaki is an associate professor at the Takasaki City University of Economics. She has received her BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Tokyo and was a visiting fellow at the Harvard University and the Johns Hopkins University. Professor Mimaki explores issues relating to US diplomacy, US attitude toward international law, and transnational peace movements in human history. Her most recent publication is Law Against Empire, or Law for Empire, American Imagination and the International Legal Order in the 20th Century, published in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. I will ask Professor Mimaki to speak for about 45 minutes, and we will open the screen for Q&A and discussion after that. The presentation and discussion in this session will be on the record. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mimaki.
Thank you, Michishita Sensei, for very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here at this very important, prestigious forum with diverse group of people from different backgrounds, from different countries. So let me share my slide first. So today's my talk is about human rights challenges facing the current Biden administration. So this is overview of my presentation. First, let me introduce some scholar called Biden doctrine. So his diplomacy has been putting democracy and human rights back on the diplomatic agenda. And since his inauguration, so Biden have emphasized the difference with the former Trump administration. And the second section, yes, Biden administration is advocating democracy, but so democracy of the US, so US democracy is crumbling, and the world is, so that's not necessarily see US as a model of democracy any longer. So in the second section, so look at some survey, and we will think about whether Americans no longer believe in democracy or not. And also let me mention the problem of capitalism. So some scholar is now increasingly insisting that capitalism is killing US democracy. And third section, so let me look at the problem of US human rights diplomacy from some perspectives. So first, I will talk about some biased understanding of US human rights. And also, so now Biden administration increasingly rely on economic sanction as a tool of human rights diplomacy. But I think these economic sanctions have so many problems, so many inhuman consequences. So let me think about that. And the fourth section, so let me briefly talk about Japan's human rights diplomacy. It's which should be different from US one, or of course there should be overlapping similarities and cooperation with US human rights diplomacy. But the fourth section will be a little bit critical one. And finally, so I want to see some signs, positive signs toward the future, and signs for more multilateral, less coercive human rights diplomacy, some possibilities, and especially focusing on the rise of a new generation, so-called Generation Z. So first, so let me introduce Biden doctrine. So after his inauguration in February, so he gave a speech on foreign policy for the first time. And in his speech, Biden said, we will work with our partner to support restoration of democracy and the rule of law. And also he said the United States will host a summit of democracy. So in coming December, it is planned to rally the nations of the world to defend democracy globally, to push back the authoritarianism's advance. So this contrast of democracy with authoritarianism. So Biden repeatedly emphasized this dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism since then. And the Summit for Democracy, this is some statement from State Department website. And they say, so democracy and human rights are under threat around the world. And also, so they say, so because now democracy and human rights are under threat around the world, we have to prove democracy still works and can improve people's lives in tangible ways. So this is one of the important purpose of coming Summit for Democracy. And we see some conflict between US and China on democracy and human rights. For example, at the first high-level US-China meeting in Alaska in last March, there was heated debate on human rights. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken emphasized, or Biden administration is committed to leading with diplomacy to strengthen the rule-based international order. And also Blinken shows some concern, deep concern with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, and also economic cohesion toward our allies. And he also emphasized each of these actions strengthen against the rule-based order that maintains global stability. But so right after that, Chinese government countered by issuing this report, the report on human rights violations in the United States, issued in March, right after the meeting. In this report, Chinese government say the US government, instead of introspecting on its own terrible human rights record, kept making irresponsible remarks on the human rights situation in other countries, of course, including China, exposing its double standards and hypocrisy on human rights. And in this report, Chinese government points out, so inhuman situations in the United States, for example, systematic racial discrimination, and even they refer, I can brief the statement of George Floyd, which stirred up the Black Lives Movement and Black Lives Matter movement last year. And also, so there's a racial discrimination also could be seen in infection rate and death rate of COVID-19. And also, they also pointed out food insecurity of the poor in the United States. And also, so about foreign policy, they pointed out US unilateral sanctions on countries including Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and Syria. And even these sanctions were continued even during the pandemic. And the Chinese government criticized its inhumane character of US economic sanction. And also, let me think about the internal domestic situation of the US. And some people say, and I also have doubt, US is now, the current US is a model, could be seen as a model of democracy. So for example, according to BDEM project, so prestigious institute on the worldwide state of democracy. So the latest report issued by BDEM project say the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is down to level last found around 1990s. So historical low level in the past 30 years. And the number of liberal democracies has dropped from 41 countries to 32 during the same time period. And BDEM also pointed out, so in North America and Western Eastern Europe, no country has advanced in democracy in the past 10 years. So also while Hungary, Poland, Serbia, Slovenia, and the United States of America have declined substantially. So they are very concerned with the current status of US democracy. And so this is from Pew Research Center survey, so last July. So many countries, including Japan, people say, yes, once US was a good model of democracy, but now, so currently no longer. For example, in Japan, 67% of people responded, oh yes, US past once was a good model of democracy, but no longer. And the average, so Canada, Italy, Greece, Spain, so these are 30 countries, the average 57% of people thought the United States was a model, but no longer. So now we cannot say the world sees the United States as a model of democracy. It is it is becoming a thing of the past. And also, so Americans themselves no longer believe in democracy according to several surveys. So now we are concerned that so many states, so this is the numbers from the last July. So now there are more states, but also significant number of states have enacted laws to make it harder to vote since the last presidential election. And mainly these states, the majority, the governor position or the majority of the state legislature are held by the Republicans. And so behind the scene, so let me introduce again Pew Research Center survey. So now, so we see wide partisan debate on whether voting right is fundamental or not. So for example, the 67% of Republicans say, so voting right it's not fundamental right. This is a privilege that can be limited. And by contrast, 78% of Democrats say, yes, voting right is fundamental. So yes, voting right is a fundamental part of democracy, but now in the United States today, so there's a wide partisan divide on voting right. So Republicans more likely say, so this is privilege, and Democrats say voting right is fundamental, that should be enjoyed by everyone. And also, so this is a survey just before the presidential election last year. So both Trump and Biden supporters say, so if the other wins, it would result in lasting harm to the country. So almost 90% of people, so for example, Biden supporter, if Trump wins, it would result in lasting harm to the country and vice versa. So according to this survey, we are not so sure that now American people believe in peaceful transition of power and election. And also, so yes, this is also a serious trend. So now both Republicans and Democrats so tend to agree, they feel justified to use violence to advance political goals. So they are becoming more likely to admit, in some cases, to use violence. So this is a very serious trend recently. And also more generally, so if we look at past 20 years, so Americans, so their pride in their own country is diminishing. So yeah, we can say that over, so for example, the last year, 63% of people, we are proud of America, of being American, still high. But if we look at past 20 years, almost 20 or 30% of decline. So now we can say that so Americans are losing their pride in their own countries. And especially if we look at the red characters, so if we look at groups, generations, gender, college degree, but so here I want to focus on the generations, ages. So young people, for example, the last year, only 20% of young Americans say, I am very proud of being American. So especially young Americans are losing their pride in their own country. And why so Americans are losing their pride in their own country? So if we look at these items, so please look at the two items below. So especially people are not so sure, people are not proud of, for example, the American health and welfare system. Only 37% of people are proud of American health and welfare system, and 62% of people, they are not proud of it. And also, so actually I was a little bit surprised for the first time when I see this survey. So now, so only 32% of Americans are proud of their American political system. And 68%, almost 70% of people say they are not proud of American political system. So a lot of Americans are now including a feeling that so something is very wrong in American political system and also social welfare system. And also let me mention some problem of capitalism. So a lot of scholars, including a number of scholars, are now concerned of capitalism, and they're thinking that capitalism has been killing US democracy, has had substantial influence of democracy. So one of the important work about this topic among recent literature. So let me introduce Branko Milanovich's Capitalism Alone. So this in this important book, Milanovic point out, for example, the Biden has emphasized that the rivalry of US-China is a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. But Milanovic say this is not the democracy vs authoritarianism. It's not the fundamental conflict. The fundamental aspect of US-China rivalry is about capitalism. And he says, so US and China, the rivalry of this country should be seen as a rivalry between two types of capitalism competing with each other. And in his words, in Milanovic's words, US is liberal meritocratic capitalism and China is state-led political capitalism. So the type of capitalism is different, but fundamentally, US and China is capitalistic country. And now in each society, some very bad aspect of capitalism is causing many problems, he says. So, and according to Milanovic, so US becoming a kind of class society. So yes, in our understanding, US is a country of free opportunity, which provide fruitful opportunity to everyone, but this is no longer true. US becoming a class society. So according to his analysis, for example, he points out, so now we are seeing the emergence of an upper class, which for the first time earns not only high dividends on capital, but high salaries and possesses high level of social, cultural, and political capital. And also these upper class people, so when they marry, so they choose the one who has similar background in education and income. So they tend to marry each other. In his words, authoritative mating. And also, so schools, so exclusive private schools, allowed for the reproduction of this new elite. So people married with similar types of person, and so they reproduce so this class through exclusive private schools. So with these structures, so now US is becoming a class society according to Milanovic. And the other important work, recent work, is Michael Sandel's Tyranny of Merits. And so the subtitle is What's Become of the Common Good. So in his book, he points out, so Americans now lost interest in common good, social bonds, and common life. And so one of the main reason of this trend is so meritocracy, according to Sandel. So in his book, actually, he talked about a lot of them, but so one of the important point of the book is harmful impact meritocracy on US democracy. So in theory, so a meritocratic society distribute wealth based on what people deserve. But in reality, this is Sanders' point. Meritocracy is not a remedy for inequality, but a justification of it. For example, the winners in Japanese word, kachigumi, in US society typically think of themselves as self-made and rarely express humility and gratitude and never care about the common good. But so nevertheless, in reality, higher education in United States today is still mostly based on family wealth, and 2/3 of Americans don't have a college degree and thus rarely have the chances for a successful career. So this situation could be seen in, for example, in lies of death of despair. So in the past 30 years, number of so-called death of despair has been rising, especially among non-Hispanic whites, aged 45 to 44. So apparently, the people with non-college degree, their death rate, their rate of death of despair is much, much higher, and it's becoming higher. So that's why, so Sanders say meritocracy is not a remedy for inequality, but justification of it. And especially in his book, Sanders criticized neoliberal Democrats elite, especially Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. So because they repeatedly expressed that American workers were themselves responsible for their losing position in globalized world due to a lack of merit. So they didn't address the inequality globalization generated, but even they appreciate. So they always put emphasis of the good thing. So they always say that meritocracy as a good thing, and they never care its corrosive effect on the dignity of work, which eventually generated resentment of the working class, leading to a populist revolt, and Trump wins in the last presidential election. So as a conclusion, so Sanders say, one of the deepest divides in the United States today is between those with college degree and without a college degree, and meritocracy, which still many people see as a good thing, is actually driving this gap, inequality gap. And so after looking at the current status of United States society, so let me think about the problem of US human rights diplomacy. So, and I want to think about some biased understanding of human rights in US human rights diplomacy. And let me introduce one of the important work related to this topic. So Samuel Moyn, he's a historian at Yale University, and especially he has focused on the human rights, the history of human rights, the idea, and the human rights diplomacy. And one of his latest book is Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. And in his book, quite comprehensive, but in his book, he asked, why the world has been so unequal regardless of repeated emphasis on human rights and the promotion by the United States human rights diplomacy. Despite this, still the world is so unequal. So this is a central question of Moyn. And so at the tentative answer, he points out, so US human rights diplomacy, so there's some general trend. As a general trend, there's a lack of focus on economic and social right compared with political right. So, and explaining the lack of focus on economic and social right, he looked at the Cold War period, and he points out Cold War ideology and international politics led the United States government to neglect the economic and social right prescribed the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so, and also US-based NGOs like Freedom House. So these NGOs have often dismissed economic and social rights as relatively less important, while quite vigorously campaigning against the torture, imprisonment, censorship, election rigging. So their focus is almost always put on political rights, and they relatively neglected social and economic human rights. This is the point of the Moyne book. And also, so now the United States, US government, more and more increase reliance on economic sanction as a tool of human rights diplomacy, especially after withdrawal from Afghanistan. So this is a statement by President Biden at the end of the war in Afghanistan, at the end of August. So in his statement, he say, it is about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. So he emphasized this is almost ending. So the era of major military operations by the United States. And also, so in August 16, so Biden also say, so this is a quite America first statement, he say, so how many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me sent to fight Afghanistan civil war? So some people say, so this is a Biden version of American first diplomacy. And also he say, so I have been clear that human rights must be the center of our foreign policy. So still, so he maintained that human rights must be the center of US foreign policy. But also he say, but the way to do it is not through endless military deployment, but diplomacy, economic tools, and rallying the world to join us. So human rights diplomacy should be continued, but not by military means, but the diplomacy and economic tools and multilateral ways, Biden said. And yes, this kind of, so what the behind the Biden statement, I see some general trend among the public, not only Biden, but Americans, so in general now, so more and more hesitate to use militaristic means in other countries, especially young people. So they are not they are not favor of military intervention. So yes, so we still, I'm not so sure we can say that now in US, there's a non-interventionist consensus, but there's some argument about non-intervention in current US society. And also, so now in the United States, people have been more aware of the cost of war, 20 years of war. And one of the important projects by Brown University Barton Institute. So 10 years ago, they launched this project, a cost of war project. And so they calculated 20 years of what is the cost of 20 years of war. And of course, we have to think about the financial cost. And so if we include veterans care over the next 30 years, 8 trillion total, the financial cost of the past 20 years war on terror. And of course, in addition to financial cost, we have to look at the other different costs. And among these, the most important one is, of course, human cost. So 73,000 national military force. If we just look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, so many people have already died. And also, so we have to think about future medical care cost for injured veterans. And so when we look at the human cost, of course, we have to think about the cost of life of civilians. So if we just look at the Afghan civilians, over 47,000 of people have died in the past 20 years. It's a huge number. And if we look at the total civilian casualties in the past 20 years of war on terror, So over 335,000 civilians have died as a direct result of the war. And if we look at war death from malnutrition, a damaged health system, and the various other reasons, so this number, the war death, far outnumber deaths from the combat. So yeah, the cost of war of the past 20 years is huge, and it still continues in the coming years. And also, so now Biden administration, they are more focusing on economic ways. And so we have to look at quite inhuman consequences of US economic sanctions. So of course, if we look at if we compare economic sanctions with militaristic means, yes, economic sanction looks more humane option, but in reality, economic sanctions have huge inhumane consequences already and in the future too. So Anthony Blinken says after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, so he emphasized that US will not lift economic sanctions in Afghanistan. But the sanctions towards Afghanistan, even this is the main target is Taliban, but these sanctions have affected not only targeted Taliban regime, but Afghanistan citizens quite generally. So while the Biden administration repeatedly emphasized, so US intend to punish the Taliban, so who has suggested the extreme risk of human rights, especially human rights, by imposing economic sanctions, but in reality, a lack of funding options has escalated the humanitarian crisis the Afghanistan people, ordinary citizens, have been facing. And according to UNDP, so in the last September, as much as 97% of Afghan population is now at risk of falling below the poverty line by mid-2022. And also, not only Afghanistan, also in Iran, US. So if we use the Trump administration's word, so US impose maximum pressure on the Iranian regime, but it's also generated quite inhuman consequences. So now, so economic growth in Iran has substantially declined. And so of course, these sanctions should have humanitarian exemptions, but in reality, it does not work. So while the United States government, US government officials have claimed that they stand with Iranian people, so they targeted Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, but they built exemptions for humanitarian imports into sanction. But in reality, these exemptions have failed to offset the strong reluctance of companies and banks to risk inviting US economic sanctions. They are afraid of having risk of inviting US economic sanction and legal action by exporting or financing humanitarian goods. And so the result has been to deny entirely Iranian citizens access to essentially medicines, especially during COVID-19 crisis. It's generated quite inhuman consequences in Iran. And also, so Iranian people, because of the US sanction, so have barred Iranian people from using this quite famous Johns Hopkins map to track the COVID-19 virus. So the influence of US economic financial sanction have the quite diverse influence in many fields. So they threat the Iranian people's daily lives, and so they make it harder for Iranian people to get this kind of information. And also Venezuela also have the huge humanitarian crisis. And so according to UNHCR, so now the refugee from Venezuela so have already reached 4 million. And so even though Latin American countries already launched some initiative to help refugees, so still we need some more international support. And so now Venezuela and Iran, so these foreign minister, they criticize UN economic sanction and financial sanction as this kind of international forum as quite inhumane. So let me introduce speech by the foreign minister of Venezuela, Jose Alejandro. So he says since 2014, so more than 300 unilateral measures have been adopted by the United States to affect the economic performance of Venezuelan people. And so now Venezuelan people, so this economic sanction hindering access to food and medicine, and also unilateral coercive measures. So according to the Venezuelan foreign minister, so they are equal to weapons of mass destruction. So he criticized US economic sanction using quite strong words. And so even he said this is a masked form of warfare. So the United States Department of the Treasury is today's economic Pentagon. So it has huge effect on the ordinary people in Venezuela, and it's quite inhumane, he said. And also, so there have rising international criticism of US economic sanction at the multilateral forum like non-aligned movement ministerial conference. So last year, the meeting was held in Caracas, Venezuela, and at the forum they say, so yes, after the end of the Cold War, the non-aligned movement has renewed its significance as a multilateral framework, and they tend to criticize US-controlled financial system. And last year at the meeting, the delegate of over 120 countries, including Iran and Venezuela, criticized US arbitrary application of economic sanctions and explored the plan even to sue the US at the International Court of Justice. And so let me introduce some important statements. So Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif say it is US that is creating instability and insecurity in the world. And again, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jose Alejandro, he said the non-aligned movement is vaccine against unilateralism by the United States and the domination of this powerful government. This is, of course, he means the United States to control men and women who believe in humanity. So they want to say this is the United States who has been violating human rights worldwide in many countries. And so let me shift my talk a little bit and let me talk about a little bit about Japan. So in this situation, so what will Japan's human rights diplomacy will look like, especially after American withdrawal from Afghanistan? So now is a time to rethink about our human rights approach, how we can approach to promote human rights in Afghanistan and in other countries. And let me introduce one important person and which poses many questions and suggestions about human rights, humanitarian assistance. So Dr. Tetsu Nakamura, so a Japanese doctor who has worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan at the border area for 20 years as head of the Peshawar Medical Association, NGO he himself founded in 1980s. So Dr. Nakamura even has involved in the construction of irrigation channels and tree planting activities to open up new farmland after severe drought hit Afghanistan in 2000. So, and he is quite famous as a bitter critic on US-led war on terror. So Dr. Nakamura criticized a quite simplistic narrative of American justice vs. Taliban evil. So for Dr. Nakamura, what was needed in order to prevent terrorism was to reduce enmity and poverty. And this couldn't be done through military force. So, and yes, and also, so Nakamura, when it was necessary for humanitarian activities, Nakamura did not hesitate to cooperate with Taliban. And also being a doctor, Nakamura often used surgery as a metaphor to describe counter-terrorism measures by military force. So according to Dr. Nakamura, surgery, so military force, it's not a solution. The best way to reduce chaos in Afghanistan should be to promote education, healthcare, reduce poverty and hunger. So this belief were behind his humanitarian activities as a doctor in Afghanistan. So so I think this the Nakamura's activities and his this kind of thinking should be an important and interesting starting point to envision future Japanese human rights diplomacy and their approaches toward human rights. So Dr. Nakamura, unfortunately, he was murdered by in Afghanistan 2 years ago. And now, so we are witnessing the Taliban's returning to power. So how should Japan treat that country? So Taliban regime versus Afghanistan people. So if we try to punish Taliban regime, so also Afghan citizens also have damages and they suffer. So it's now is a very difficult time for Japanese humanitarian activities. So how can we evaluate the consequences of US-led war on terror? So toward a more secure and human world, what Japan should do? So maybe at the discussion section, so I'm happy to have discussion about, of course, US human rights diplomacy, but also the future of Japanese human rights diplomacy. And so finally, let me briefly mention some positive signs in the United States toward a more multilateral, less coercive human rights diplomacy. So I have several doubts, so that's why I added the question mark, but there are some positive signs toward this more multilateral, less coercive human rights diplomacy. So especially I'm now looking at the rise of new generation, so-called Generation Z, so who was born 1997 onward. So yes, in this generation, so some new up the signs of new approaches to foreign affairs. So these new generations, so for them, America is not an exceptional strong country. So they realize America has many weak points. America is not so strong. So they think that this new generation think America cannot be alone in an interconnected world. So Generation Z, these new young Americans, that's not necessarily opposed to pursuing national interest, yet they think only with the understanding of the interconnected world. So they also have some America first tendency, but they also have the attention to the interconnectedness of the world. This is a difference from the Trump version of American first. And these young generation prefer president who works to improve America's relation with other countries. So they prefer more cooperative America rather than one who just narrowly focuses on issues in the United States. And so they are very concerned of the environmental issue, human rights issue, and world poverty. So they have some kind of cosmopolitan minds, cosmopolitan tendencies. So yes, this is still, I have a question, but there's some signs of multilateral turn in US foreign policy because the young people are now realize US weakness. So they don't believe US is strong enough, so they are realize US weakness. So according to UN Association survey, so millennials and this generation Z have over 50% favorable view of the United Nations, so which is much higher than the current the member of US Congress. And also the same poll also finds that US can put partisan politics aside to come together in support of the United Nations. So not only they are the support of the Democratic Party, but also Republican Party. This, if we look at generation, they have quite a favorable view of the United Nations. For example, the average 63% of young Americans have favorable view. They support UN and they think that UN is supportive of American interests around the world. And so 59, almost 60% of Republicans agree with the UN is supportive of American interests. And if we look at Democrats, 70% agree to belong to the UN. So yes, if we look at the new generation, so they have more multilateral cooperative tendencies. So we can say that there's some multilateral turn in US foreign policy, more multilateral approaches towards human rights. So this is the end of my slide, and thank you for listening. And I'm really looking forward to having the questions from discussant and from the floor. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Mimaki, for the presentation.